Okay, welcome. Hello and welcome to this evening's Institute of Creativity Distinguished Fellowship Lecture. Now, the Institute of Creativity was set up in 2011 with a generous donation from the Hung In Shui Charitable Foundation, and the aim was to provide a home and a workplace for eminent scholars to pursue research here at Hong Kong Baptist University. To many of you here, tonight's speaker is someone who needs no introduction, but for the benefit of others present, it's a great honour for me to introduce the artist and educator, Professor John Aiken. John has had a very long and distinguished career in academia and as an artist. He's lectured and been a visiting artist at many universities and art schools in Europe, Australia, Asia, the United States and Canada. He has run two of the world's best art schools, the Slade in London and the Academy of Visual Arts at Hong Kong Baptist University. And at both institutions, John has taught and nurtured the talents of numerous highly acclaimed artists, and he's upheld the strongest and most important principles of our education. The South China Morning Post referred to John in an article about him as a warrior of the arts. It's a mistake. As an artist, John has an equally distinguished and long-standing career, and I first encountered his work in an exhibition in 1993 at the Hayward Gallery in London, and the piece that John made had a profound effect on me, actually, and that's one of the reasons why I went to study at the Slade. So I have a personal debt of gratitude to pay to John. But also, John has exhibited internationally and extensively in galleries in Norway, Paris, Dublin, Italy, and here in Hong Kong and in Portugal. And his practice now is going on, and we shall see the work that he's doing in a minute. John has also a very strong commitment to public art and its interface with architecture and urban environments. And many of his works can be found in the public domain and enjoyed there. So, John, it's a great honour and a pleasure to welcome you back to Hong Kong. Ladies and gentlemen, John Aiken.
Far be it from me to correct the director of the Academy of Visual Arts, but Caroline did send me a photograph of that work. No, it wasn't 93, it was 83.
83, sorry, I meant 83.
And there it is. This was an exhibition called the Sculpture Show at the Hayward and the Serpentine Gallery, and I made this installation based on a previous work that I'd made 2 months earlier in Oslo, actually, in Jonstad Foundation. But it was it's a good example. It was probably the first British museum-type show I'd done, and unlike everywhere in Europe, the restrictions on what you can do in a gallery like the Hayward are immense. You could be there all day, but only actually do about an hour's work, because we had to queue up for a very limited number of technicians. You couldn't put anything on the wall, you couldn't do anything on the floor unless it was very carefully pressed. So it was a kind of lesson on the kind of strictures of working in this kind of public space. But 35 years ago this was made. I'm not going to show anything older than about 15 years at most. And actually I'm not going to show an awful lot of my work, because tonight is really about this kind of notion of the kind of interface about what I look at, how I see things, how I explore things, in a sense how I come up with ideas. And I thought long and hard about what I should do for this. I'll refer to this as a talk now, not a lecture, because with this audience I think I can be less academic than I was planning to be. But when I was at the Slade and appointed as the Slade chair in 2000, the year before we appointed a new head of history and theory, and that was Professor Norman Bryson, who came to Slade from Harvard, and I think he's gone back to Harvard now, or maybe Berkeley or somewhere. But Norman was very much into the notion of, well, he's into many notions, but one of the things he really liked exploring was the notion of the flaneur, somebody culturally or low culture, high culture, walking around cities. And he gave me a book, and it's taken me 2 months of stress trying to remember what the name of this book and who the author was, but I still can't, because I read it nearly 20 years ago. But it was basically it was a novelist, a lady, and she wrote this story about walking. But at the bottom of the page was a single line, a sort of narrative which ran all the way through the book as a line. And this was almost like a parallel story. And this is what I decided I would work on for this lecture. Somehow make these two divergent, convergent stories work. And it took me a lot of time to get this right, and I may not have got it right, but bear with me. That's right. So the theme is one that I've been dealing with for a very long time in my work and in my research, and it's about identity, edge, and border. Identity is a really quite a big thing for me, because because of Brexit, I've just got my Irish passport, so I'm dual nationality now, Irish and British. I left Ireland at a time when border was a real issue, and civil rights, and it was not a very pleasant place to be. And the danger, of course, is it might go back to that in the near future with Brexit. So border is an area which is very much in the news at the moment. Border, border in terms of borders becoming harder around the world, the rise of nationalism and people being more conscious of protecting their borders, and also protecting their identity. It's something which on one hand you could say is good, on the other hand it could be very bad. And there's a lot of examples of very bad notions of maintaining a national identity. When I left AVA, I flew straight to Portugal, and I've worked in Portugal for a very long time, but I've never lived there, and I've gone from a kind of situation which is, all my life I lived in big cities, Belfast, London, Rome, and Hong Kong. So for the first time in my life, I've lived in the countryside for a year, and I enjoy it very much. But one of the things which I've been doing is just walking around the hillsides and areas around where I live, and finding things which have a kind of resonance. And these are markers just dotted around the countryside which determine the ownership of certain bits of land, sometimes very small, sometimes very enigmatic. They're hidden, you have to reveal them. They're kind of new in this case. Just finding a piece of stone in the right place and painting it and putting initials on it, taking ownership of it, and taking like a signature for the landscape. This is where I live. It's the view from the house looking towards a farm, which is this walled building in the middle, which is going to be my studio and the kind of artist retreat space. And behind where I'm taking this photograph is the foothills of the mountains which go into the centre of Portugal. Very different from Hong Kong, and I do like Hong Kong for very much the reasons that you see there. It's such a dynamic and visually exciting place, but a very exciting and visual urban space, but ironically with lots of walks around it. I did do a lot of walking when I was here. This is a view of the field next to the farm, and at the bottom of the field is often a herd of goats. And this is important in terms of this notion of wandering the countryside, because I wander the countryside where the goats have wandered, so there's a series of pathways around these hillsides. So the goats are creating a line, or a series of lines across the landscape in a rather meandering form. There's a lot of stone walls, In this case, this is the kind of wall that you get around the houses, manicured to some extent. But it's an area where farming has disappeared essentially. So a lot of the land's been deserted, and these very labour-intensive clearing the fields to make stone walls that are collapsing into these sort of scree slopes. You also get the expats trying to identify themselves in their houses, because of course none of these houses have got addresses. So you get these crazy, I should say most of those are British, because they've got a kind of lack of style. That's my Irish voice. And a lot of ruined properties, rather like villages in the New Territories, where in the 1950s or 60s it just became economically unviable, and people up and left often just walked out. And there's a farm beside our house, which was like the Marie Celeste. I went into it, and it had, the beds were still there, there was clothes in the wardrobe, but it hadn't been used for probably 40 or 50 years. So, going back slightly to what Louis was saying, he was on his foundation in 83. I started my foundation in 68, and like most art schools at the time, the foundation courses would begin with a week of drawing. And of course this is a slightly altered line from Paul Clay and his Bauhaus teaching sketchbook. And I think the real quote is a line made by walking. The act of making the impression of others is more or less that. And this is a slide from that period of when I started art school by Richard Long. This is Richard Long making a line by walking in Peru. This is 1972, which is actually the year I graduated from undergraduate. So the goats don't do quite that straight a line, and neither do I. This is another work at that time, taking a line for a walk, which is Dennis Oppenheim, and this is also from 1968, and it's called Annual Rings. And of course Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty from the Great Salt Lake, 1970. So why I'm showing these and some other works from around that time was these were redefining, in a sense, what public art could be. It was moving away from traditional notions of the monument in the outdoor space and the object in the indoor space. It was using materials in a different way. It was a different sense of ambition. And it was also quite startling for a young student starting a career in art, which was very much determined by a kind of school curriculum up to this point. This is another piece by Richard Long in Crefeld at the Hausliner, and this was a Mies van der Rohe, two Mies van der Rohe houses essentially in Crefeld, which were donated as an art museum. This again is from '69, I think. And I started to find equivalents in the landscape for these just when I'm walking, noticing things. This is a sort of stone ring which is used for drying crops, or would have been used for drying crops in the at least 50 years ago. And last week or the week before, the ants started to create these little earth circles, as the soil got loose because of rain. Normally in the summer this ground is baked rock hard, so all over the landscape you're getting these little rings of soil. And this is Michael Heiser. Michael Heiser working at the same time essentially in terms of earth art, and this is from '69 and '70. And when I was looking up some facts about these works, because I took it for granted I knew all about them, and then I realized I didn't. But the Spiral Jetty is 457 meters long, And Michael Heiser's double negative is 457 meters long as well, which must be a coincidence, but it's rather strange. But this, I think, is a wonderful work, and a work which really integrates in the landscape but also stands out from the landscape. In this case, it's, as I said, 475 meters long, 15 meters deep, and 9 meters across. And it spans this little gap in the landscape. This is in Utah. And these are these small marker stones again, acting as a pathway or acting as a sort of continuation. So these little stones are going to infiltrate all the way through this talk, and it's really about this one line at the bottom of the page, this one journey which is taking place throughout the talk. And this was a piece, I apologize because at least half of you probably have seen some of these works before, but this is a piece which I made I think a year or two before I came to Hong Kong, but it was a reenactment of a work that I was doing when I was a student in Rome. And this was about coming to terms with being in a new place, coming to terms with being in a new city. And in order to do that, you spend a lot of time walking around, looking at things, but you don't really know where you are. You don't have access beyond the street. And this was taking a walk from the British School of Rome and wandering around the area near the Borghese Gardens and then coming back. And where I crossed my path in this walk, I would break through the original sandbar. It's made out of soft sand, so it's very crumbly. And roughly, you can sort of follow it. The two bits at the end there, the one on the left was the start. And then as I was coming back on myself, I started to break through that one. So it was a bit occupying space. And I did another work inspired really by walking around the new territories, but also Annie is somewhere, yes, introduced me to this little, now non-existent walled town, walled village in Lok Fu. And I did a bit of research into it and started to make a piece for the museum in Kaohsiung in Taiwan. And again, it was about walking around this little village, or what's left of it, in this grid shape. And in this case, it's even more culturally different for me. So my sense of walking in these streets was that I had actually culturally no interface with what was behind the doors, what was in these sometimes derelict buildings. The only space I could occupy, the only space I could occupy on a very temporary basis was the streets, or the little alleyways. This is it. I'm right in saying it's gone now, isn't it? I mean, it's disappeared. Demolished. Okay. So this was in the museum in Kaohsiung, and it was really following the pattern of the Rome piece, where I entered the village, walked around what I could, I came out again, and it was this kind of the experience then was left in the museum for I think 6 or 8 weeks. And it slowly crumbled, slowly fell away. So as my memory of not only making the piece, but my memory of being involved in the walk itself also was fading, and so this work would fade and eventually just disappear into dust, into nothing. And a couple of years ago, I was in New York, and I talked about this piece at the International Public Art Awards 2 years ago. But this is Highline in New York. It's this is a very stylish picture of it. But it was the elevated train which ran through what's now Chelsea and up to Greenwich Village, in fact, and it was around the meatpackers district of New York and served the meatpacking district with trains bringing meat in and taking meat out. It was scheduled for demolition, and several sections were demolished, in fact, but then it was saved and turned into this urban park, urban sculpture park, but also landscape. And it's now that those areas, Chelsea and Greenwich Village in particular, have become very expensive and very upmarket. Of course, the problem is gentrification has caused its own problems. So that's the track of the High Line as a kind of sculpture park or as a walk. It's very clearly defined. You're on an elevated platform, which of course in itself defines it within that space of the urban space it's occupying. And it ends up at the New Whitney Museum of American Art. This is it, meandering through. And I think this is a good example of something which was a good idea, and it's happened in other cities. So there's an elevated park in Paris as well. But all these photographs generally show it completely empty, and it is rather beautiful and doing what it set out to do. And it ends up with this other, I think, amazing piece of work, which is the Tony Smith's Die, D-I-E. Sorry, lost my place, I can't see today. So this is also from 1968, a 6-foot cube. The concept and the statement it addressed was a key element in the development of the expanded field of sculpture. In a way, it was a kind of such a minimal statement, it really changed the way people saw things. It was neither object nor monument, although actually sitting on there it looks rather like a monument to me, but it was designed to not be a monument. If it was over 6 foot, Tony Smith thought it was going to be a monument. If it was under 6 foot, it would be an object. So it had to have this kind of neutrality. And also it broke some new ground because it was architectural references. It was absolutely an industrial manufacture. It was Corten steel, and it went to a factory and was made to a very tight specification. It transformed really the way sculpture could look. It transformed how it could be made and how it could be understood. And of course, it looks like a big plinth there, but of course this is what it was arguing against, because most sculpture up until certainly the 50s would have been located on plinths, whether it was in a public space or in a private space. And that whole thing was changing around the time which I was starting to look at contemporary art. This is how it normally looks. Not like that, but like that. So the success of this space as a public space and an interaction with not only design but with architecture and with a number of really not very good artworks, except for the Tony Smith. It's become a victim of its own success, as many reactivated or recycled or upcycled neighborhoods become. So this is actually a bit like going on to the MTR in rush hour. It's not a pleasant experience which it was intended to be. It's actually a rather unpleasant experience. Another marker in one of these tumbling down walls, which has actually tumbled down, and I thought this was particularly interesting to me because it resonated with some work I did, which was quite challenging for me because, as I said, I always worked in urban landscapes and urban spaces, and I was asked to do a series of works, come up with a proposal for a forest in Scotland, and it took me a very long time to work out how I was going to manage this, because I didn't think I could just put something into this forest unless it could reference the forest and my experience of walking through the forest. So I decided I would make a series of markers. I called them markers. They would be very unlike the environment they were in, so they were completely unnatural. They were highly machined and they were highly polished. And they were dropped into areas which I thought had a resonance for me. I liked the space, I got a good feeling from where I was. I identified with this particular location. this was one of 4 which were on different areas of this forest land, made out of black and white polished granite. This is a metre long, and I was trying to use almost a kind of surveyor's methodology for this. So this little cross section, diagonal blocks, was like how something would be a kind of instrument for measuring place. This was another little one. It's only 30 centimeters long, and I very carefully carved a slot in this granite boulder and fitted it into it exactly on a horizontal plane. This was a border between the heathland and the forest, and this is just again 2 slabs of granite sitting, in this case, on the water, but sometimes in the winter the water will be over it, sometimes the water is just it's like a meniscus over it. So it changes as the weather changed and the seasons changed. And I found this photograph about border edge, which seemed to me to be very apposite. This is Northern Ireland on the left, and Southern Ireland, Era on the right. Different road surface, different road markings, different police uniforms. And this is kind of very much where the great problem with Brexit lies, about how to avoid Northern Ireland being a hard border again. And my experience of Northern Ireland was this was a hard and a very dangerous border for most of my teenage years and well into when I started teaching Belfast. So these hard borders existed all the way around, all the roads coming from the north into the south and vice versa. But they started to interest me in these structures that went up on a temporary basis. And that is actually, I'm not sure it's very good as camouflage, but actually it's not a bad painting in a public space. And I started to look at these structures around every city, every town, every village in Northern Ireland, particularly along the border, as sculptural structures, if you disassociate yourself with what their intention was. So these are the kind of things which existed, and actually to some extent still do exist, all over Northern Ireland. These watchtowers with this kind of curious set of constructions which were strategic and pragmatic, stop people shooting at them and let them see what was going on. But they also became a very big intervention in these urban spaces. This is another series of watchtowers along the border. And of course these are things which still exist in Israel and Palestine, and between Israel and Gaza. Trump is trying to do this. He's moving the military into the fence, the wall at the southern border with Mexico. And on a more domestic scale, this kind of ridiculous situation where they build a wall between 2 streets, the back gardens, one side Catholic, one side Protestant. Of course, once they go out the front door, they're all sharing the same street, but this is this curious, ridiculous situation where a very expensive wall is built to stop neighbors abusing one another. And a series of wall posters, I suppose, were painted on the wall, and sectarianism bring down the walls. So this is a very politically motivated and a very politically sensitive area still. And that's why this whole notion of the border being made hard again is such a problem. And each community goes about things in its own way. This is on the 12th of July every year, the Protestant community, or at least some sections of the Protestant community, celebrate a famous battle. And they build these bonfires. And this is kind of a feat of engineering. I think what they did before the palette was quite difficult because they couldn't obtain these kind of skyscrapers, but also the methodology of getting up, these sort of steps that they're built into it. It becomes a really strong sculptural form and ends up like this, massive. And of course, when they start to fall down, they set off fires all over the place. But they're incredible structures, and they're very well organized, and they just, as I say, in my childhood they were a few branches and a few old boxes and a few tires. They're nothing like this. They're like stupai that you get in Myanmar or in the East. And this is, well, it's not squashed in there. This is really a continuation of the discussion about Tony Smith. This is Tony Craig from 1975, and it's called Stack. And in his case, it's, because he's metric, it's 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. And it's material which is really abject and abandoned material brought in from the street, so from a public space, a random public space, and brought into the public space of the gallery space and reconstructed. So it's not exactly recycling, but it's upcycling. It's taking the ordinary discarded object, the ordinary discarded material, and turning it into this geometric form. Rainbow over the farm, and this was last week when it started raining. And not so long after I came here, of course, there was the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, which again I think produced an incredible sense of creative energy, as well as dealing with all the hard facts of identity, having a voice. And I think it was something which really energized the whole city, and certainly energized the students. And this kind of rainbow of umbrellas was an extraordinary visual experience, and not one that I was expecting to see in Hong Kong. And as a result of this, the students at AVA made, I think, one of my favorite public artworks, which was, I put this in relation to Tony Craig, because these were umbrellas which were salvaged after the police intervention. And of course they were in a bad state. They had pepper spray on them, they had tear gas on them, they were dirty, they were in the gutter. And the students disassembled them and started to sew them together. There was actually more at it than this one. And they put it up in Admiralty across the 2 footbridges going over to the government buildings. And I thought this was just a fantastic use of found material which had a great resonance, which had a great sense of the particular, but also included a very wide series of issues, but also a very wide series of people's involvement. So each of those umbrellas had an owner and abandoned it for whatever reason. And then there was a great deal of care taken in putting these together again. So I think this is really one of my favorite public artworks. And there's another controversial piece of work with quite a disgruntled Richard Serres posing in front of it. This is Tilted Arc. And I'm going to forget my facts again here. Well, I'll remember most of them. Tilted Arc was a competition which was to put into this Federal Plaza in New York, and from the outset it created a lot of controversy. It was not what people expected of a public work of art, although Richard Serres had a very strong reputation already at this time. And it was eventually had to be taken down. And I think this is the kind of elegant view of it. I think when this photograph was taken, it was already starting to be slightly abandoned, this square, and there's rubbish and detritus, and there's been a little bit of graffiti on it which has been taken off. So the authorities, in a way to speed up it, the general public feeling how to go, they neglected it. And there was a series of artists, a number of artists and critics were trying to get this debate going about why this should be there, why it was not being there, what constituted public art, what constituted the interface between the public's notion of what should be in a public space and the artist's notion of what should be in a public space. And I think some of the discussion in this document, this exhibition, is rather now, 30 odd years later, slightly suspect, because it was really talking about the intellect and elitism of the artists as opposed to the public having a kind of much less sophisticated view, and therefore did you take that into consideration or did you ignore it, and so on. That view, I think, has changed very considerably now, and some of the works I'm going to show, more recent works in public space, are taking almost an opposite view, where it's all about engagement with public, it's all about working together with the public to create something, rather than saying, well, I think this is a big sculptural statement, and if you like it or don't like it, it doesn't matter, because it's got its own integrity as a work of art. So the aesthetic quest of public life was the nature of this exhibition, which was really, I think it was 25 artists and critics writing about why this work was important in terms of public engagement. That's it before and after, and this will come up a bit later in terms of the sculpture I have outside the AAB building. So they replaced it with these rather nice seat lanterns. And I really can't see how they could be considered more publicly appealing. They're completely at odds with the space. And this is it when it was all about to go. The abject object in an abject space. And of course, now we've got another object in an abject space. This is part of Trump's wall on the Mexico US border. And this wall has started to become a real site for really quite creative artworks. It's currently, I think, 1,000 kilometers long, or even 2,000 kilometers long. It's going to be even bigger. But I can't quite understand why it ends here. It must be a gate. But there's a work by a Mexican-American artist. No, bear with me. Ana Fernandez is her name, and she did a project in 2016, which was to make the wall invisible. And she proposed this on a number of sites along the wall, and working with local communities and working with other artists, she proceeded to paint sections of the wall a kind of notional color, which was the color of the blue sky. And you'll see at the top left-hand side there, I'm working on it. Conceptually, I think she wanted to paint the whole wall, but it wasn't going to happen. This is her painting. And there's another artist working on the wall. This is JR. He's a French street artist. And he made this piece, which was, he photographed the eyes of one of the, I can't remember the name. It's one of that generation of the DACA kids that were brought into the country illegally, but are still in the country, but they can't get citizenship and they can't get right to remain. So they're in this kind of, the dreamers. They're in this kind of halfway house where they don't know whether they can stay in America or they have to go, and in fact Trump has decided they have to go, so the DACA has been revoked. So these are the eyes of one of these dreamer children or young people, and JR decided he would make it into a picnic table which spanned the border. So he invited people from the north of the border and south of the border to share this table, share this picnic. And it was disallowed by the American authorities. They didn't want him to publicize it, so we didn't know whether anybody would turn up or a few people would turn up, and in fact it was hundreds of people turned up to share this sort of experience together of being across this divide, across this border, but actually enjoying the same thing. And he also did another work, which was, this is on the Mexican side of the border, and it's a billboard. And I think it's sort of interesting that you don't see it properly from the Americans, from the Mexico side, but you see it entirely from the US side, and it's this young Mexican child peering over this fence. Now, it struck me, this monumental sculpture of a young Chairman Mao did seem to have some sort of resonance with this. I think this will cost considerably less than that one, which I think was $500 million US. But again, from a political point of view, this is quite interesting because this is Mao not as an elder statesman, but not associated with a lot of things which subsequent Chinese governments were not so keen on, but as a young person, emphasizing the notion that this is forward-looking, it's about the new China, and so on and so on. But it's still a huge monument, and it's still this almost this notion of narcissistic sculpture, where often dictators, generally dictators, put their portraits or their sculptures of themselves around all important public spaces. That's the remains of a windmill, and another one of these markers around by my house. And an example of these kind of almost narcissistic sculptures is this rather famous little tantrum 2-year-old in Oslo, Vigeland Park. Vigeland was a sculptor in Norway, probably the most famous Norwegian sculptor, but he has a sculpture park all of his own, just outside Oslo, and it's a very strange place. It's the biggest sculpture park in the world for an individual artist, and I think in fact he is buried there. He has his tomb as well. But it was done between 1939 and 1949, so it spanned that whole period of Europe in a kind of nationalist fervor, and it was famous for a number of things, one of which was that everybody in this park is naked, which was not common at that time. So he has these kind of writhing figures all over it, and this column of naked bodies extending up to the sky. Now, when you start to associate this with concentration camps and the kind of things which were happening during the Second World War, and its sort of notion of how fascism has adopted this kind of style, it becomes a very kind of poignant and potent piece of work. But I'm not sure that's what he was intended to do with it. But this column is like that. I mean, obviously it's phallic as well. But at the end of September this year, I went to Barcelona to go to an exhibition, and this exhibition was held in the area outside Barcelona called Vilafranca de Panedes, and it's where cava, the Spanish sparkling wine, is made. So it's quite a wealthy area, but it's also deeply embedded in the Catalonian culture and this culture of wanting independence. So it's very much about identity, it's about their own language, it's about how they operate in the world and how they operate with and in harmony with Spain, but also not want to be part of Spain. And after the opening, we went to a restaurant, and they said, "You'll enjoy this restaurant, John." And I said, "I'm sure I will." And it was a very good restaurant, but it was part of a kind of social club. And it was the social club where the whole community, young, old, male, female, in some cases disabled, practice these human pyramids. And this gone out of sound again. Let's try. So while I was sitting having my dinner, they all come out of the indoor space and started practicing these, creating these columns of bodies. Big old men at the bottom, younger men, next level, young women, then children. And this was a kind of extraordinary experience of seeing people working together to construct something, and to construct something quite magical. So where somebody comes out and says silencio, and then you've got to be quiet because they've got to concentrate on making this thing. So for maybe just a few minutes, this is a minute long, and the instructor's giving these little kids some instructions about what to do at the top. So as a kind of living sculpture, I think this is a great piece of public art. And there's a very big festival every year where the various cities and towns compete with each other to do the most elaborate and highest one of these human pyramids, or human columns. The kind of concentration of the community spirit that this was creating was, I think, absolutely fantastic. This is, oops, sorry. This is what it looks like in terms of the festivals. So the restaurant, this was their team performing somewhere by creating this extraordinary high structure. So again, another excellent piece of public art. Temporary, but very, very, very pertinent, very potent. And talking about narcissistic sculptures and, in fact, narcissistic artists, this is really well aware of this series of Ali Gormley's in cast iron and bronze, and I think they were cast iron dotted around Hong Kong several years ago, and subsequently dotted around many other cities. I do find it odd that he doesn't see that this is so close to, I don't know, Ceausescu or somebody putting statues of himself all over Bucharest. So I found this milestone, which says me, I think it's Michele Eduardo or somebody, number 3, and I was trying desperately, just because it's in the news so much, to find one which was Me Too, but I couldn't find Me Too. And I don't know where Me Too was. It may have been censored by this very male-dominated society in Portugal. But Me 3 seemed to be quite pertinent for Antony's activities. Another one, looking towards the Bank of China. And of course, his big work is the Angel of the North, which is the 20th anniversary of this being put up this year, 2018. And this is another work which was very controversial, because the locals really didn't want it, and they never do. It's that the local press gets excited by these things. I had a sculpture which made the front page of the Sun newspaper, which was when somebody from the Daily Mail phoned me up to say, what did I think about this? I said, fantastic. You know, it's every artist's dream to make the front page of the Sun newspaper. And it was, of course, it's the same story, waste of public money. It was affectionately called the People's Pebble. I'm not sure if it was affectionately called the People's Pebble, but the authority of the commission were off their rockers, and it was rock on, and all these fabulous tabloid newspaper headlines. But I think Antony's is a little bit more difficult. This was the original piece, which I saw this when it was first shown. He made an exhibition, I think it must have been in the late 80s, in a space in London, and this was one of the works. And I think actually I quite like this, but I'm not so keen on how it translates into this structural. But the Gateshead Post didn't like it, so Nazi but nice. And they make the comparison between Germany 1935, the angel commissioned by Hitler is saluted by the Luftwaffe. So you can see the three little planes in the top there. And Gateshead 1995, the angel planned as a symbol of welcome to Gateshead by poor Anthony. This is him when he was making this sculpture. This one. And this is the kind of problem that people have with public art. They take ownership of it in a number of ways. This was Morrison's, the supermarket, projecting a baguette, a French loaf, on it to advertise that they're cheaper. Anthony was not amused by this, and I think lawyers were involved. And Anthony thought it was, going back to the argument about tilted arc, most people at this stage, which was only a few years ago, were thinking that that's what public space is for. You do things with it. You're ironic, you take advantage of it. But he still wanted this. He thought it was a kind of disrespectful to the high art, which of course it is. And I think this is him calling God's wrath down on the people who perpetrated this. But I think this is even worse. This is Lego's version of the Angel of the North, which must be one of the worst Lego constructions I've ever seen. I don't know who designed it, but it is bad. And Caroline, my wife, photographed this in the sky above our house a couple of months ago, and I was almost going to send it to me and say, I didn't know you're really upscaled and taking over the sky. Now it's this winged figure flying through the clouds. I wasn't sure whether you'd take that as something which was funny or take it as an insult. But this is an example of what happens to narcissistic sculpture. It gets put in, dumped in parks, and Stalin here is having this little girl poke her finger in his ear, which he certainly is looking very stern about. And it's happening all over Eastern Europe. We have these parks where, as countries disassociated themselves with the USSR and became independent, these statues were relegated to some distant parkland. And in this case, in Hungary, the only bit left of Stalin is his boots. A bronze statue which somebody has stolen except for his boots. So it becomes quite a conceptual piece now. And this is a work by Jochen Goetz, who is an artist I know quite well, based in Paris. So I apologize for this being in French, but it's, for those of you who need translation, I'll do it. This is 1990, Goetz clandestinely, with some students from the École Beaux-Arts, started to lift up the paver with these little granite paving sets from the square in front of the Chateau de Saarbrücken. And this was the headquarters for the Gestapo during the war. And on each of these little slabs, he and the students inscribed the name of a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery in Germany, and then put it back in place with the inscription face down. Now, I certainly believe he was doing this clandestinely, but I can't believe he did the whole square clandestinely, and he did a lot of these. So these are the little sets, and I think somebody must have noticed that he was repaving it, because it's quite a formal piece of ground, and it's quite a formal building. So I don't know whether he did a few of these, or he did hundreds of meters of them, but anyway, as an idea, I think of memory, of identity, of lost identity being reinvigorated, but then also reinterred. I think it was a very nice, quiet, but very humble public artwork which comes and goes, but it's still there in the ground. And there's the second piece he did in Hamburg, which is the monument against fascism. And this was a 12-meter high column in steel, which was faced with lead sheet. And it was an invitation to etch into this your thoughts, and it was across generations. And people would come and use a steel stylus, which was attached to it, to write in it, to give their thoughts to, in some cases people were spray painting on as well, but after a certain period of time, in 7 sections, this was slowly lowered into the ground. I apologize for the quality of that slide. So that's it more or less at the beginning. This is probably 2 or 3 sessions later, where it's disappearing into this platform. And eventually it's just a 1 meter square in the floor of the platform, and there's documentation of it on this explanation board to the left-hand side. So it's, again, it's about community engagement, people working on it together across generations, and this being a memory as well as a location. And in Faro, there's something which has a similar resonance to those last 2 works by Jochen. This is a cemetery in a monastery, and these are the grave markers of the priests who have died or the monks who have died over several centuries. And the notion of identity being reduced to this number, you're not, you don't have a name anymore, you just have a number. And after a certain number of years, you're disinterred, so you not only do you don't even have a number anymore, you just have a skeleton. And these bones are turned into a chapel. It's called the Capella de Ossos, chapel of bones, and it's just leg bones and skulls. And it's quite a strange sensation being in this kind of vaulted bone house. That's the roof. And strangely enough, what comes out about is the individual character of these skulls. You just think it's a skull, but they are incredibly different. You know, the proportions of them, the way they're structured, you can really see a different person in each skull. But it's a bizarre experience, and it's almost, you're not really sure what these, you're sure what they are, but you don't normally see knee joints like this. And this absurdity is something which has been carried on in terms of a kind of memorial to the celebrating the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, which was on the 11th of November this year. And this was Danny Boyle, the filmmaker, film director, working with artists across the whole of the England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And they would rake these portraits into the sand of the beaches around the countryside, and there would be some ordinary people who died, and they had some photographs of them, and there would be some more famous people. This is Wilfred Owen, the war poet. And they would do it at low tide. They would rake these drawings into the beach, and then of course when high tide came, they were erased. So it's about demonstrating memory and loss. This is Dr. Inglis, who was a feminist and a doctor working in the First World War in Scotland. But I can't remember the number of these, but all these sandy beaches right around the country were had one of these on the 11th of the 11th. It's a windmill nearby, the remains of a windmill. And this is another absurd piece of work, which actually I found quite close to that one. This is Erwin Worth, German sculpture, and this is Big House in Vienna. And it struck me as a kind of such a bizarre object. He also did a narrow house, which didn't work quite the same, but I find this just the whole modulation of this structure with this proper roof on it very odd. And it started to remind me of a project that I did many years ago when I was working very precisely on border and edge and looking at structures around the edge of Europe. And this is not quite the same. This is another absurd little, I think, sculpture in a street in Tavira in southern Portugal. And it's defining an area, but in such a kind of peculiar way. I think it must be a restaurant or a cafe, but it wasn't functioning. So you just had this, I think, public sculpture, which could equally find itself on show in something like the Munster or Documenta. But it just has a fabulous little, very precise, but also very strange and mysterious why it should be there, occupying a parking space. And this is another Dennis Oppenheim, which was taking the floor plan of a gallery and putting it in a number of spaces outside as on a snowy beach. This is a sign in Portugal which hasn't yet been signed. It's just prepared it but not done it. It's an anonymous plot. And this is the last sculpture I made here, which is outside. So outside this building, no, outside the next building along. And this was done to really try and bring attention to the entrance to this building. And I used this technique, which I've done a number of times, of the black and white stripes. And it was based on an Islamic style of architecture called ablak, where they use these alternating layers of light and dark colored stone. And this was brought from brought by the Arabs into Europe and the Crusaders into Europe because they wanted to make their churches in particular special. So in Italy you could only use this technique on churches. You couldn't use it anywhere else because the church was special. Now, the notion of public sculpture is rather like Richard Serra. It's intended to be like that, but the university decided they wanted to put potted plants around it to protect the general public from it. And from the ground view, I hate the potted plants, but from above, I rather like it actually. It's like bursts of something natural against this hard, polished stone. So, from a pictorial perspective, I think the plants work, but from a 3D perspective, they definitely don't. And they're still there, it's amazing. But again, on my walk, I discovered there was a kindred spirit in Sambrage de Alportel, and I happened upon this rather nondescript house who decided they needed to jazz it up by putting black and white tiles all along one flank. So again, it's kind of theatre of the absurd. Another version of Dennis Oppenheim's gallery transposed into a snowfield. And again, 2 weeks ago I was walking and saw in the distance that a farmer or somebody had made this square of turned earth, and you got this bright orangey red square in the middle of this green field, and it was so much like a work of art for me, and it's still like this. I don't know if they're going to plant cabbages or something. And reminded me of this other Dennis Oppenheim piece, which is salt, a rectangle of salt, which of course, as the salt gets exposed to moisture in the air, it eventually turns to moisture and disappears. So it's a very time-sensitive piece of work. And this was kind of time sensitive as well. I liked this as a piece of work. It reminded me about Dennis Oppenheim. This is the director of the Academy of Visual Arts parking space. In June, I came in one day and the director of the Academy, or the office of the director of the Academy of Art had been painted out. And I was retiring, but I hadn't actually left quite yet. So I did talk to estates one day when I met the head of estates and said, you know, I'm very sorry that you decided to have gone already and sort of wiped me out of the CVA building. They said, oh, no, we just needed repainting. And of course it did. I was being facetious. And it's back to the director's office. So Louis, that will happen to you at some point in the future. And one last stone, I think, on the walk. And back to Anthony's Cloud, because this is an artist who's also very interesting, Fluxus artist. I knew this would happen. Wolf Vostell. And he did a project in Chicago with the Chicago Museum of Modern Art and the University of Chicago in 1970, where he was looking at concrete as a material. And he made a number of proposals, and one of which was the concrete cloud, which would be 1.5 kilometers in length. So, in some ways, I'm rather, this seems to be a more intriguing way of putting an unusual object into the sky rather than Anthony doing one of his narcissistic sculptures in the sky. Of course, this is completely unrealizable, but as the concept of it is, I think, really rather good. But he did realize this one, which was casting a car, or encasing a car in concrete. And he encased a 1957 Dodge, or Chevrolet, I think it was, in concrete, and then this was placed in a public space, a parking lot. It's been moved several times since, and it must have had damn good suspension, this car, because it hold this weight. But I think this is a very interesting work. And I think also the project I was doing in the 70s was recording and documenting the concrete structures of the Atlantic Wall, the defenses made against the Allied invasion by the German forces. And this is a structure which was a gun emplacement, I think, but it's probably, well, it's definitely thousands of tons of concrete, but it's being turned from the horizontal to the vertical by sea or erosion. And it took me back as one I think is an interesting piece of sculpture, monumental sculpture. But it also took me back to when the expanded field of sculpture began when I was an early sculpture student. Instead of the kind of where you do it this way, you follow this technique, you learn how to stone carve, you learn how to make things out of wood, you learn how to make molding things. You weren't allowed really to do that. I mean, you did do it, but it was not deemed to be the proper thing to do in the expanded field of sculpture. And the critique at that time was largely down to, if it's not working, cut it in half, and if that doesn't work, turn it upside down, and if that doesn't work, throw it away. So it was a kind of simplistic notion of what constituted a successful sculpture. But I think this is a very interesting image of an extraordinary piece of architecture. And this is another car by Vostell in Cologne, still there, on a traffic island in the middle of 4 lanes. And this is a piece by Le Corbusier in a new city he designed in India. But I think it's such a kind of bizarre pulpit in the middle of nowhere that it becomes a sculpture form, becomes a sculptural object. And this is a kind of, Antony's was a big me, and this is actually a small me, and this is me. And this is a piece that I'm working on at the moment, a big public sculpture in Cascais, which is near, just about 10 kilometers outside of Lisbon. And in 2010, I was invited to do an exhibition at the Cultural Centre there, which is the building on the left of this picture with the gable roof. And it was also a monastery which was destroyed during the earthquake in the 18th century and rebuilt. But it still has some old bits in it, including a chapel. And I did an exhibition of drawings and works on small works in this chapel. But opposite the fortress, they asked me to do a public work on a temporary basis, which I did. And this temporary work was made by me and an assistant in a month, and it was designed to be there for 3 months, the 3 months of the exhibition. But at the end of the 3 months, they said, could they keep it for the rest of the year? And I said, sure, but be aware that it's only built out of wood underneath and rock. Well, this summer, they got in touch with me and said, John, we'd like to make your sculpture permanent. And I said, well, it's been there 8 years. You know, so it should be falling apart, and it is. But it's acquired squatters' rights. After 7 years, if something is in a public space and it hasn't been moved, then it can stay there. So I've acquired squatters' rights, and they've asked me to remake it and reconfigure it and redesign it to some extent. So this fortress is now quite a kind of chic place. The building on the right at the far edge is the weekend palace of the President of Portugal, and the other buildings have become a 5-star hotel. And there's a whole museum quarter around here. So I wanted to work more with the shape of this fortress, because when I did it 10 years ago, you couldn't get into this fortress, you couldn't explore it, you couldn't walk around the walls. So this was the temporary work, which looks permanent, but it's made out of granite, but it's all on a wooden subframe. And it was really based on, again, a notion of journey. When I was working in Portugal on a number of big public artworks, I would go from Lisbon, drive to the quarry, which was on the Spanish border, and I passed a lot of little towns, little border towns, which really hadn't changed much in 200 or 300 years. So it was just like this progression of small towns on top and sides. This is its location by the fortress. And this is an early drawing of the fortress. And I decided what I would do when I was remaking it was use more of these kind of angles. And this is a drawing of what it's going to be like. I'm still working on it. I'm working on it while I'm here. This is going to go onto CAD to be sent off to a factory to make it happen in reality. And finally, this again is one of the best public sculptures in the world. It's Piero Manzoni, and it's in Italian, or French now, but it's called Base of the World. And I think this puts Antony to shame, because this is actually the biggest sculpture in the world, because it is the world. It's a plinth for the world, so it can go anywhere in the world, and the world will be the sculpture, and this will be the plinth. So it's upside down, and I think it's just a great concept, and it's a homage to Galileo. So on that note, I will finish, and I'm very happy to answer some questions if you have any. Thank you very much.